Welcome back, everyone. So in this section, we're going to talk about sharing your work. So as Brian mentioned, on the OSF, things can remain private forever if you want them to. But there also might be reasons why you want to share either all of your research outputs and process, or maybe just some of your research outputs and process. And so we're going to talk through some of the reasons you might want to do that, how to get credit if you do that, and how to make your work discoverable. So, sharing. So some problems related to not sharing work are a couple of different things. The first is, if somebody doesn't share anything about how they analyze their data, or their data itself, or the materials, it's actually hard to check the reproducibility of that work, right? I can't rerun their analyses, I can't try and recreate their protocols. But perhaps more important to me as a researcher, just as like an individual researcher, it becomes hard to build off of other people's work if I don't have the materials they use. So if I read an article, I'm like, oh, that is a really awesome article, it actually dovetails really nicely with some work I'm doing, I would love to do a replication and extension off of that, or even just an extension off of that. But then they use a scale and they give me, an example item of the scale, and I email them for the full scale, and maybe they're like on vacation, I can never get it. I can't then build off of that work. I can't give them a citation. I can't use that to move my own research forward. And so sharing can actually make me less efficient in doing new research, and it can make reproducibility harder to check. Additionally, oftentimes when people do share, they may share in ways that are suboptimal in terms of how long they're going to exist for. So lab web pages are a really common place to share. Lab web pages are not particularly stable, right? We move institutions, we move universities a lot, and lab web pages will eventually go dead, links can go dead, and so you've done all the work, you've documented everything, you're sharing your materials, and then you forget to move them when you move institutions. So what are some solutions to these? The first is to think about sharing the parts of the research that you can or that you feel comfortable with, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, and also share in ways that are stable and will allow you to get credit for your work, right? If I go through all the trouble of sharing, I would like to be able to get citations for that if people are using what I've put out there in the world. So some things to consider before you even think about sharing. The first is, especially if you're going to be sharing data, did I get approval for public sharing and possible reuse, right? Depending on how you write your IRBs or your consent forms, you may have to think about this pretty early on if you're going to be sharing data. Another thing is potential legal issues, right? Is it ethical to share the data that I have? Or if I'm thinking about materials, are there copyrights on any of the materials I want to share, right? These are just classical things that you're going to want to think about before sharing. And also, possibly really importantly, are my materials usable? So if I go through the bother of sharing my data, I want to make sure that other people can understand that data and build off it and reuse it. So, did I provide a guide to the data? Did I say what all those different variables mean? So we're going to actually talk about how you share in 1 second, but I did want to talk about sharing as a continuum, with data sharing as an example of this, because sometimes when people say share your data, researchers may assume that when I say share the data, I mean the raw data, all the data you collected from the study. Some people will be ethically allowed to share that and feel comfortable sharing that. But there are kind of other ways of sharing data that can still get us some positive outcomes for reproducibility, for building off of other people's work, that aren't quite that full, raw, open from the beginning data. So one thing you can do is share the data just underlying that particular article, right? If you've collected a huge longitudinal study, maybe you are going to get, or we're planning to get 5 different articles out of it. So maybe it makes sense for you to just share the data underlying particular articles as they get published, rather than sharing that entire data set from the outset. That's one type of sharing. It's a perfectly valid type of sharing. Another type of sharing might be share all the data underlying that article, but also share the full codebook. So say, here's the data that underlies this article, here are all the other variables I collected in my data set. So if you see that I have data that might be of interest to your research, you know that I have it, you can get in contact with me, maybe we can start some discussion about a collaboration and actually start a really cool new research idea together. Another thing you sometimes see with really large data sets is people will share the data underlying that particular article, they will share the full codebook, and then they will share the full data set eventually. They'll basically put it under an embargo. They'll say, I was planning to get a couple of articles out of this, so my research team is going to house the full data set for 5 years. But if I haven't gotten things out of it in 5 years, I'm probably never going to get any more out of it. 5 years is just what I happen to use. So after 5 years, I'm going to publicly post that whole data set, and anybody can reuse whatever parts of the data set they want and build off of it. And another one is to share from the first publication the full data set and the full codebook. So this is a continuum of how much data you're sharing when. Each of these are steps, and you see a lot of researchers slowly work their way up in those steps, but step one is still a fine step. So don't necessarily think that you have to go all the way to the end from the very beginning. We can also think about, when we talk data sharing, what type of data we're sharing. So if I'm doing research that has no sensitive data in it and isn't particularly large, maybe I can share the full raw data set. But maybe somebody else is doing data and the IRB has said, you really cannot share those IP addresses in your data set, right? You have to take those out before you share the data set. I then can create 2 data sets. I can have the raw data set, which has all the variables in it, and that one never gets shared. I then create another data set. I have the analysis script that gets me from point A to point B, and I share that subsection of the data set with some information about, hey, these are the variables that's missing. This is why my IRB has said I cannot share this. If those variables are really of interest to you, here are the steps you would have to go through to ethically access that data, right? Here's how you get in contact with me. Here's what I would need from you. If it's data where the IRB has said you can share none of this at the individual level, you can also think about maybe sharing at a macro level, maybe being a little bit more transparent about those overall demographics of the data, putting in a little bit more information about the skew of the data so that people can get a little bit more information about your data. But once again, putting in that information of, if you wanted to ever recreate this data set, here are the steps you would have to go through based on my IRB to do that. So when we talk about data sharing, it really is a continuum. So before we do the activity, I'm going to actually show how to do some of this. I'm actually going to show how to do some of this on the OSF. Right, so I mentioned that lab web pages are not the most stable thing in the world, and we've gone through all this trouble of creating this research space on the OSF. I have the files related to my project up here. So I can think about actually, what do I want to share? So the first thing to think about is literally, what can I share? I have a couple of files up here. I have a questionnaire file, I have an analysis file, and I have a raw data file. Some of you may have noticed that the raw data file actually has a zip code variable in it. The zip code variable is made up. I added that for demonstration purposes. So let's say my IRB has said, hey, you cannot actually share the data that has the zip code variable that is non-shareable data. So I say, okay, but I still want to share the other data related to my project. So I'm actually going to upload another file, which is the clean data, which doesn't have that particular variable. And then I'm going to go into my data file, my data component, and add a new component underneath it. Identified data. I'm going to call data. I'm going to give everyone access to it. So once I'm inside identified data, I'm going to move my raw data file underneath there. So why in the world have I done this? Well, I mentioned that components have different public-privacy settings. So if I want to make this whole project public, I can click on this button, and I could select everything. Or I could expand this and say, I want to make materials and data public. I do not want to make that identified data section public. So by clicking continue, what's going to happen is anybody can see what's in my wiki, anybody can see my questionnaire file, anybody can see my analysis and clean data, but this identified data component is still private. It's with the rest of my project, so I always remember what data I used, but it's locked so that other people cannot get access to it. They can only get access to it, to the data that the IRB has said it's ethically allowable to share. So I've made this data public. When I say public, I really do mean public. Anybody can find it. And public projects are actually indexed by Google. So if I Google, I'm going to Google Daniel Lakins. effect size. And what you'll see is one of the first thing that comes up is actually an OSF project related to a Frontiers article he published. So I mentioned that if we make our things publicly available, we want to make sure that we can get credit for that work. So a couple things about the OSF in terms of getting credit. So I mentioned that there's a citation. So this citation is automatically generated based off the contributor list. So if you make something public, you have told people this is how I would like to be cited for it. The project and the subcomponents get citations. So somebody can cite just the part of your work that they're reusing. They can cite just your materials. They can cite just your data. Additionally, everything on the system is given GUIs, globally unique identifiers, which are these little 5-letter last sections of that URL. Those are links that will always resolve to this project. So I can put those links, use them for citations. I can put them on my lab webpage. I can put those links in my publications if I want to show people exactly where I've shared this content to make it more discoverable, make it easier for them to find exactly what they want, make it so they can cite exactly what they want. Everything on the site gets those GUIDs, the project, the components, every single file on there. So you can really point people towards what they might want. But we know that there are other types of information other than citations that we might want to know if we're sharing something on the internet. So for example, if I go to the Analytics tab for Daniel's project, I can see on any particular day or over a span of time how many people are visiting this project and where in the world they're coming from. So today it's mostly the US and Western Europe. So I can get information about how many people might be interested in my content. Additionally, if I go to the Files section, I get a download count of how many times anyone has downloaded these files. So this article is open access in Frontier. It's been cited around 340 times. If you notice, the article has been downloaded nearly over 1,800 times, and 2 of the supplemental files have been downloaded 1,000 times. So those download counts are giving very different information about perhaps how many people are interested in reusing this material. They're showing it has more impact than that citation count might indicate. So when you make something public, there are different ways to make sure you get credit for that work and you can track the impact. So in terms of making things discoverable, right, if we go through the bother of sharing, we want to make sure that people can find things. I mentioned the GUID links. I mentioned how they're indexed by Google. There's also search on the OSF proper. I can make things a little bit more discoverable by adding tags to my project, which are really just keywords. So if I want to tell people, my collaborator has actually added some tags for me, gender, ideology. I might also know that I maybe want to put ANIS 2012, so if somebody is searching for things that use the ANIS dataset, this will come up, and so that's just a way to increase the discoverability. The final thing with sharing is a lot of times now we're talking about having conversations about things after they become public, right? There's a lot of, after they become published, there's a lot of talk on blogs, on Facebook, on Twitter about articles. Those conversations are all happening really far away from the article, so it's actually hard to keep track of those conversations later on. So one thing we might want to do is think about how can we bring the conversation closer to the content itself. So those two things are connected, right? That post-publication conversation is another piece of that research workflow. So there's commenting on the OSF. So Brian has actually made a comment. Once again, he bets it's Brian's idea. So I can add a comment. I can reply to his comment. I can say, you know, look at the logs. Courtney made the research question first. And if I decide for some reason that Brian really is just a troll and is spamming me, I can report him as spam. But this conversation is going to show up with that project, and I, as the owner of the project, can decide whether I just want commenting to be internal with the collaborators or if I want to open commenting up to any OSF user. So in terms of sharing, there's going to be a couple of activities. So I would like you, the PIs, to create a new component called analyses and move the files that you can share into that component. So the analysis.r script, and then share that component without sharing the raw data files. So right, figure out how to take advantage of the different privacy settings on those different components. And then with your group, kind of discuss, have you, what part of the project you want to share, what part, could the IRB allow you to share, and then share at least one part. And then for the research assistants, add at least one tag to the project. Once again, this will be a short activity. Brian and I will be moseying around the room. If you have questions or run into any problems, just raise your hand and we'll come around. And then we'll come back for Q&A. All right, so now that we've finished up the activity related to sharing, we're going to take some time to answer questions related to sharing. This one can often be a tricky one, so please feel free to ask questions related to either how to share or what sharing means for your particular type of research.
I work in clinical psychology and work with some sensitive data sets. And I'm wondering about, so I've heard about the badges. Obviously, I want all the badges. And I'm wondering about what the standards would be, whether they'd be different for clinical data sets that you couldn't ethically share, and sort of what the best practices are in that area.
So I think in terms of data sharing, when you have sensitive data, obviously, ethically, you cannot share the raw data, or you can't share certain variables. So one way to do it is to share the variables that the IRB has said, these are allowable. Maybe those aren't all the variables you used in your analysis, but they're at least part of it. And then as I was mentioning, if there is a way that somebody could ever ethically access the data set, maybe they have to talk to you, sign a data agreement, something like that, give people a roadmap for how to do that. So if they really did want to go through the process of doing that, you've kind of outlined that for them.
So just as a quick follow-on to that, for most cases, it's possible to remove the identifying information and still be able to reproduce the analyses that are the basis of the article. That's not for all cases, but for most cases, you can anonymize it sufficiently so that it can be reproduced or used for other purposes without sacrificing some of the critical privacy concerns. For cases where that's not possible, for example, the key analysis has zip code, date of birth, and a couple of other demographics in it. Well, that combination of information might be able to actually identify individuals, and particularly individuals where it's sensitive information that you wouldn't want that shared. The Courtney's suggestion is very good, which is keep that restricted, but if you want to facilitate reuse of it when the person has sufficient IRB approval to access such data, just put in the wiki, these are the ways in which you can request the data. Here's the subset of data that I can share, if any, and here's the way to ask for the rest. Question over here.
So yeah, I also sometimes work with confidential data such as individual student test scores that I can report in the aggregate but cannot release individual level. Is it possible when you share it and you say, okay, I've shared the aggregate but I haven't shared the individual, can you at least I guess I could probably figure it out, but make it known that this data exists if you can then come to me from sort of agreement to have access to it, or go through the same process that I went through to originally get access to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So where I would tend to put that information is in the wiki of the data component that houses the shared data. So, I tend to use the wiki to describe my project. So for the data wiki, I would say, this is a subsection of the data because the IRB has said it's not ethical to share these other sections. Here are the steps you would want to go through to either contact me if I'm the one who has to give you access, or if I got this from another source, here's what I had to do, here's the source I got it from, here's what you would have to do. The wiki is where I would put that, but you could also write that in a Word document, name it something that is obvious to people that that's what it's going to be, and upload that to the section where you've shared the subset of the data or the aggregate level data.
Just as a quick follow-up, in a future release, we will expand what is public-private it's one or the other, to a middle ground where you can request access. So you would be able to say, this is what's behind the curtain, and this is how you would access it. And that'd be a part of the button of sort of partial sharing. But there are some things still to work out in that process to make sure we cover all use cases before we release that as a feature.
All right, great. Thanks so much for the questions. And so this is going to be the end of the sharing section. Up next, we're going to talk a little bit about incentives.